47 years of war had carved themselves into Draven Kasuth's body like a map of suffering. His left antenna was missing, torn away by shrapnel during the siege of Meloran Prime. 3 deep scars crossed his chest plate where enemy blades had found their mark. His right leg clicked when he walked, rebuilt with metal after a plasma blast had destroyed the original. He had watched planets burn. He had seen entire civilizations reduced to ash. He had held dying soldiers in his arms and listened to their final words. Commander Draven Kasuth of the Velmari Defense Forces was considered one of the most battle-hardened warriors in the galaxy, and now he had been assigned to babysit a medical station. Draven walked through the corridors of Station Aurelia 7 with barely hidden disgust. The walls were too clean. The air smelled of sanitizer instead of smoke. Doctors and nurses moved past him with soft steps, their bodies unmarked by combat. This was a punishment. It had to be. After decades of frontline service, High Command had decided to stick him in this floating hospital orbiting some neutral world nobody cared about. Station Director Meliora greeted him in her office. She was a Sindathi, tall and willowy, with the typical pale blue skin of her kind. Her voice was gentle when she spoke. Commander Kasuth, welcome to Aurelia 7. I know this assignment may seem beneath your experience, but I assure you, your presence here is important. Draven grunted. What exactly am I supposed to be protecting? Bandages? Medicine supplies? Meliora's expression shifted slightly. Something that might have been amusement crossed her features. We have recently accepted our first human medical staff. The Coalition wants an experienced officer to oversee security during this integration period. Humans. Draven had heard of them. A young species, barely spacefaring for 2 centuries. They had joined the Galactic Coalition just 15 years ago. Everything he had read about them suggested they were fragile creatures from a moderately dangerous world. Soft skin, no natural armor, no claws or venom. Their only notable feature was their endurance, which many species dismissed as exaggeration. You assigned a 47-year combat veteran to protect some soft-skinned doctors. Draven asked. I requested you specifically, Meliora replied. Trust me, Commander. You may find this assignment more educational than you expect. Draven doubted that very much that he spent the next few hours touring the station. The human quarters were kept at conditions he found mildly uncomfortable. The temperature was higher than standard, and the air held more moisture. The lighting seemed dimmer, adjusted for human eyes that apparently could not handle standard brightness. Everything about their setup suggested a species that needed constant accommodation. Constant protection from an environment that any proper species should handle without difficulty. Draven was examining the security protocols outside the human medical wing when one of them approached him. You must be Commander Kasuth. The human was small. His skin was dark brown, smooth, and completely unprotected. No scales, no chitin, no hardened plates. Just thin, soft tissue stretched over fragile bones. He smiled, showing flat teeth that could not possibly tear through anything tougher than cooked meat. I am Dr. David Okonkwo, the human continued, Chief Medical Officer for the human staff. Director Meliora mentioned you would be arriving today. Draven looked down at him. The human barely reached his shoulder. His frame was lean, almost delicate. His hands were small, with thin fingers that looked like they might snap under any real pressure. Doctor, Draven acknowledged with minimal courtesy. David did not seem bothered by the cold reception. I understand you have an impressive service record. 47 years of combat experience. The staff here feels much safer knowing someone like you is watching over us. Safer, as if Draven had been reduced to a glorified security guard for creatures who probably bruised if they bumped into furniture. I will do my duty, Draven said flatly. David nodded, still smiling. That is all anyone can ask. If you ever need medical attention yourself, please do not hesitate to visit our wing. Human medicine has made some interesting advances that other species have found beneficial. Draven almost laughed. Human medicine. What could these fragile creatures possibly know about treating real injuries? About patching together bodies that had been torn apart by war? Before he could respond, an alarm shattered the station's calm. Red lights flashed. A computerized voice announced emergency protocols. Draven's combat instincts kicked in immediately. His hand went to his sidearm as he processed the alert. Shuttle collision. Docking Bay 7. Fire and atmospheric breach. Mass casualties. Draven was moving before he finished thinking. His damaged leg protested, but he ignored it. He had run on worse. He had fought on worse. A shuttle crash was nothing compared to the horrors he had survived. He expected to find chaos. He expected to coordinate rescue efforts and body recovery. He expected the soft medical staff to be standing around in shock, waiting for someone competent to take charge. What he did not expect was to see Dr. David Okonkwo sprinting past him toward the danger. The human ran directly toward the flames, toward the toxic smoke, toward the screaming. He did not wait for protective gear. He did not hesitate. He just ran. Draven stopped in his tracks, confused. That was not the behavior of a fragile species. That was not the careful self-preservation of soft creatures who needed protection. That was something else entirely. And for the first time in 47 years, Commander Draven Kasuth did not know what he was looking at. Smoke poured from the ruptured docking bay like blood from an open wound. Draven had seen enough combat zones to recognize the signs of serious damage. Structural beams had collapsed. Electrical fires sparked between twisted metal. Worst of all, one of the chemical storage containers had cracked, releasing chlorine gas into the air. Chlorine. Even trace amounts could damage respiratory systems. Most species would be coughing blood within minutes of exposure. Draven pulled on his emergency respirator and activated his tactical display. Temperature readings showed the interior of the bay at 58 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to cause heat stroke in most coalition species within 15 to 20 minutes. He pushed through the outer doors and stopped. Dr. David Okonkwo was already inside. The human wore only a basic cloth mask over his mouth and nose. Not a proper respirator. Not a sealed suit. Just thin fabric that could not possibly filter out the chlorine. His eyes were red and streaming with tears. His dark skin glistened with sweat. He coughed violently every few seconds, his whole body shaking with the effort, and he was pulling survivors from the wreckage. Draven watched as David dragged a wounded Sindathi away from a burning section of hull. The human's movements were desperate but controlled. He checked the Sindathi's breathing, positioned her for safety, then immediately turned back toward the flames. "Doctor," Draven shouted through his mask. "Fall back. You do not have proper protection." David looked at him with watering eyes. "There are still people trapped. I can hear them." He ran back into the smoke. Draven stood frozen for a moment. This was insane. The human should be collapsing. The heat alone should have incapacitated him by now. The chlorine should be destroying his lungs with every breath. Instead, David kept working. Other rescue teams began arriving. Properly equipped Velmari and Sindathi personnel moved into the bay with full environmental suits. Draven coordinated their efforts, directing teams towards structural weak points and potential survivor locations. But his eyes kept returning to the human. An hour passed. Then 90 minutes. A Sindathi medic collapsed from heat exposure after just 40 minutes in the bay. She had to be carried out, unconscious and barely breathing. David was still working. His skin had turned an alarming shade of red. His movements had slowed. He stumbled twice while carrying a wounded crew member to safety. But he refused to stop. Every time someone tried to pull him out, he pointed toward another section of wreckage and said the same thing. "I can hear them. They are still alive." Finally, after 2 hours and 17 minutes, the last survivor was extracted. Draven grabbed David by the arm and physically hauled him out of the bay. The human did not resist. He seemed barely conscious, his body finally acknowledging the punishment it had endured. Medical teams rushed him to the treatment center while Draven filed his initial report. That night, Draven could not sleep. He sat in his quarters and accessed the station's database, searching for information about humans. What he found made no sense. Humans were persistence predators. Their ancestors had hunted by chasing prey across vast distances until the target collapsed from exhaustion. Not faster than their prey, not stronger, just relentless. They would follow an animal for hours, sometimes days, until it simply could not run anymore. Their bodies were designed for endurance. They could regulate their internal temperature through sweating, a process most species found disgusting but incredibly effective. They could function in temperature ranges that would kill a Velmari in hours. They could survive blood loss, broken bones, organ damage, and infections that would be death sentences for other species. They healed. Constantly. Relentlessly. Their bodies treated every injury as a problem to be solved rather than a permanent condition. Draven thought about the Sindathi medic who had collapsed after 40 minutes. She would need days of treatment before she could return to duty. David Okonkwo was back at work the next morning. Draven found him in the medical bay, treating patients from the crash. The human skin was still reddened from the heat exposure. Bandages covered chemical burns on his arms. His voice was rough from the chlorine damage to his throat, but he was working, smiling at patients, checking charts, giving orders to his staff. "Doctor," Draven said carefully, "you should be in bed. Your injuries from yesterday were significant." David looked up and shrugged. "Minor burns. Some respiratory irritation. Nothing that will not heal in a few days. You were exposed to chlorine gas for over 2 hours." "Yes, that was unpleasant," David agreed. "But human lungs are fairly resilient. The tissue is already regenerating. I will be back to full capacity within a week." Draven stared at him. A week. The man had breath poisoned for 2 hours, worked in lethal heat until his skin burned, and he expected to be fully healed in a week. "How?" Draven asked quietly. "How is that possible?" David seemed to consider the question seriously. "Evolution, I suppose. Earth is not a gentle world, Commander. Our bodies learn to take punishment and keep going. It was survive or die, and our ancestors were very stubborn about the dying part." He smiled again, that strange human expression that showed their flat teeth. "We are harder to kill than we look." Draven left the medical bay with a new feeling settling in his chest. It took him hours to identify it because he had not felt it in decades. It was unease, and it was growing. 3 weeks after the shuttle crash, Draven began watching the humans more carefully, not as a security officer monitoring potential threats. As a soldier trying to understand an enemy he had badly underestimated. They moved differently than other species. That was the first thing he noticed. Every human on the station carried themselves with a strange combination of caution and confidence. They were aware of their surroundings, but not afraid of them. They moved through spaces like they expected danger, but had long ago accepted it as normal. The second thing he noticed was the scars. Every human had them. Old wounds that had healed but left their marks. A nurse named Priya walked with a slight limp, the result of a childhood accident that had shattered her knee. Another doctor had burn scars across his hands from a fire years ago. One of the technicians was missing 2 fingers on his left hand. They spoke about these injuries casually, almost dismissively, like losing fingers or shattering bones was simply part of existing. Draven found himself sitting with David during a quiet meal period. The human was eating something that smelled strongly of spices, occasionally wincing as the heat irritated his still healing throat. "May I ask you something personal?" Draven said. David looked up. "Of course." Draven pointed at a long scar running down the human's forearm. It was pale against his dark skin, clearly old but still visible. "That scar. How did you get it?" David glanced at his arm like he had forgotten the mark existed. "Oh, that. I fell out of a tree when I was 7 years old. My arm bone broke and came through the skin. Compound fracture, the doctors called it." Draven felt his stomach turn. A compound fracture. The bone had broken so badly it had torn through the flesh. On a Velmari, such an injury would end a military career. The limb would never function properly again. "What happened after?" Draven asked. "Surgery to set the bone. A cast for a few months. Physical therapy." David shrugged. "I was climbing trees again by the end of the year." "Climbing trees," Draven repeated flatly. "The same activity that nearly destroyed your arm." "Children are not known for learning from their mistakes," David said with a small laugh. "Besides, the bone healed stronger than before. That is how human bodies work. We break. We heal. We become tougher." Draven processed this information. "Your bones become stronger after breaking?" "Usually, yes. The healing process reinforces the damaged area. It is why athletes sometimes recover from injuries and perform better than before." David took another bite of his food. "Our bodies treat damage as a lesson. They learn from it." That night, Draven accessed the human medical records in the station database. He had proper clearance for security purposes. What he found kept him awake until morning. Compound fractures that healed completely. Humans who had broken the same bone multiple times and continued functioning normally. Internal organ damage that regenerated. Livers that could regrow from partial tissue. Kidneys that compensated for each other if one was damaged. Limb reattachment surgeries. Humans whose severed hands or arms had been surgically reconnected and eventually regained function. Humans who had been clinically dead. Their hearts had stopped. Their brains had ceased activity. And doctors had brought them back, restarted their hearts, restored their consciousness, returned them to life. Point 1 file made Draven stop scrolling entirely that a human staff member named Grace had survived cancer. The records described it in clinical terms. Abnormal cells had grown inside her body. They had spread through her organs, eating her from within. The treatment had involved poisoning her entire system with chemicals so toxic they nearly killed her, and she had survived. The cancer was gone. Grace was alive. She worked in the administrative section of the medical bay, filing reports and scheduling appointments. Draven had walked past her a dozen times without knowing that her own body had once tried to kill her, and she had won. He found himself standing outside the medical bay the next morning, watching the humans work. They moved efficiently, treating patients and organizing supplies. None of them seemed extraordinary. They looked soft and fragile and completely ordinary, but every single one of them was a survivor. Not of wars or battles or military campaigns. Survivors of simply being human. Survivors of a biology that constantly tested them, broke them, and forced them to heal. Draven approached David during a quiet moment. How, he asked. The question had been building in him for days. How did your species become like this? David set down his datapad and considered the question. His expression grew thoughtful, almost distant. Earth was trying to kill us, he said simply. Every day, in 1,000 different ways. Disease, predators, weather, natural disasters. Our own bodies turning against us. And we just refused to die. He met Draven's eyes. Stubbornness, Commander. That is the human survival strategy. We are too stubborn to know when we should give up. Draven thought about his 47 years of combat. He thought about the soldiers he had watched die from injuries far less severe than what these humans described surviving. That he thought about what kind of world could produce creatures who considered compound fractures and cancer and clinical death to be inconveniences rather than endings. And for the first time, Commander Draven Kasuth looked at humans and felt something other than dismissal. He felt respect, and beneath that respect, growing stronger every day, was fear. The observation deck was empty during late shift. Most station personnel were asleep or working in the medical bays. Only Draven stood at the massive windows, staring at the stars and thinking about everything he had learned. Footsteps approached behind him. He did not need to turn to know it was David. You have been avoiding me, the human said, coming to stand beside him. I noticed. Draven did not deny it. I needed time to process. Process what? Your species. Draven finally turned to look at him. I have been reading about Earth. About humans. I do not understand how you exist. David's expression shifted to something between amusement and curiosity. What specifically confuses you? Show me, Draven said. Show me your homeworld. Help me understand. David considered this for a moment, then pulled out his personal datapad. He connected it to the observation deck's holographic display system. The stars outside faded as images began to form in the air between them. Earth appeared, blue and green and white. Spinning slowly in the darkness, Draven's first thought was that it looked beautiful. His second thought, as the data overlays began appearing, was that it looked like a death trap. Temperature ranges, David said, highlighting different regions. -90 degrees Celsius at the poles. +57 degrees in the deserts. Humans live in both. Draven stared. A temperature variation of nearly 150 degrees. Most species would die within hours at either extreme. Atmospheric composition, David continued. 21% oxygen. Our air is so oxygen-rich that forest fires can spread across thousands of kilometers. The entire planet is essentially a fire hazard. The display shifted to show biological threats. Viruses, bacteria, parasites, an endless parade of microscopic killers that evolved constantly to bypass human immune systems. We estimate that infectious diseases have killed more humans throughout our history than all wars combined, David said calmly. And we are still here. Predators appeared next. Creatures with claws and fangs and venom. Sharks that sensed blood in the water. Bears that could tear a human apart with casual ease. Insects that carried diseases capable of killing millions. Earth has approximately 8.7 million species, David explained. Many of them would happily eat us. poison us, or infect us given the chance. The display changed again. Tectonic maps showed fault lines crisscrossing the planet's surface. Draven watched animations of earthquakes destroying cities, tsunamis swallowing coastlines, volcanic eruptions burying entire regions in ash and fire. Our planet actively tries to shake us off, David said. The ground itself is unstable. We build our cities on moving plates of rock and hope they do not shift too suddenly. Hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, droughts, ice ages, mass extinction events. Every new piece of information made Draven's tactical instincts scream louder. This was not a homeworld. This was a Category 12 Deathworld, the highest danger classification the Coalition used. Planets rated Category 12 were typically considered uninhabitable. Humans had not just survived there. They had thrived. They had built civilizations, developed technology, created art and music and philosophy, all while their planet tried to kill them in every way imaginable. Your own history, Draven said quietly. Tell me about that. David's expression grew more serious. Wars. Constant wars. Humans fighting humans for resources, territory, ideology. We have killed each other in numbers that most species would consider impossible. He pulled up historical data. Disease outbreaks that wiped out third of continents. Nuclear weapons that could sterilize entire cities in seconds. Humans had developed and used such weapons on each other. Ice ages that lasted thousands of years. Famines that starved millions. Plagues that emptied countries. David's voice remained steady, but something heavier lay beneath the words. We survived all of it. Not because we are the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. Just because we refused to stop trying. Draven looked at the human beside him. Small, fragile looking, soft skin and flat teeth and thin bones. But behind those mild eyes was a creature forged by impossible pressure. A being whose ancestors had clawed their way through hell itself and passed that stubborn survival instinct down through countless generations. My people evolved on a stable world, Draven said slowly. Temperate climate, minimal predators, predictable seasons. We became warriors because we chose to. Because we found glory in combat. He paused. Your people became survivors because you had no choice. Your planet gave you no other option. David nodded. That is probably accurate. An alert chimed through the station. Draven's military training kicked in immediately. He checked his communicator and felt his chest tighten. Priority message. A coalition vessel was under attack in a nearby system. Heavy casualties reported. Station Aurelia 7 was the closest medical facility. Among the casualties were humans. Diplomatic staff who had been aboard the vessel when the attack occurred. David was already moving toward the door. I need to prepare my team. Draven followed him. For the first time since this assignment began, he was genuinely worried about what he might see. Not worried about humans dying. Worried about what kind of damage they might survive. The medical bay had become a war zone of its own kind. Casualties poured in from the attacked vessel. 200 crew members had been aboard when enemy forces struck. Nearly half were dead. The rest were wounded, some critically. Medical teams worked frantically to save who they could. Draven coordinated the incoming shuttles, directing traffic and maintaining security. He had seen mass casualty events before. He had walked through battlefields where bodies lay in heaps. He thought nothing could shock him anymore that he was wrong. The human survivors began arriving. The first was a man named Robert, a diplomatic aide. His left arm was gone below the elbow, severed by shrapnel during the attack. Blood soaked the emergency bandages wrapped around the stump. His face was pale from blood loss, but he was conscious. Talking, asking the medics about his colleagues. Draven watched Robert being wheeled past and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The man should be dead, or at least unconscious. The blood loss alone should have killed him. Instead, he was discussing the attack with medical staff like he had merely stubbed his toe. More humans came through. Burns, fractures, internal bleeding, shrapnel wounds, injuries that would have been immediately fatal for Velmari, for Sindathi, for any species Draven knew. The humans were alive. Damaged, broken, bleeding, but alive. Then they brought in the woman. Her name was Amara. She had been caught in an explosion when the ship's fuel cells ruptured. Third-degree burns covered 40% of her body. Multiple bones were broken. Internal scans showed bleeding in her abdomen. damage to her spleen and liver. By every medical standard Draven knew, she was dying. Her injuries were not survivable. He had seen soldiers with half her wounds die within minutes. Amara was conscious. She looked up at the medics with eyes that were somehow still focused, still aware. Her voice came out as a ragged whisper. "My daughter. Is my daughter okay?" Draven felt his legs lock in place. He could not move. He could not look away. This woman was dying. Her body was destroyed. She should be screaming in agony or slipping into the peaceful darkness of death. Instead, she was asking about her child. David appeared beside the gurney, already giving orders. "Prep surgery bay 3. I need blood standing by. All human-compatible types. Get me the burn unit on standby." "Doctor," one of the nurses said carefully. "Her injuries are—" "I know what her injuries are," David interrupted. "We are going to save her anyway. Move." They moved. Draven watched them wheel Amara away. His mind kept trying to process what he had just seen and failing. In 47 years of combat, he had developed an instinct for death. He could look at a wounded soldier and know within seconds whether they would live or die. Everything in his experience told him Amara would die. The humans around him seemed to disagree. Hours passed. Draven stayed in the medical bay, unable to leave. He watched the human medical staff work on their wounded with a focus that bordered on fanatical. They refused to give up. They refused to accept death as an answer. Robert, the man who had lost his arm, came out of surgery stabilized. He was already asking about prosthetic options, already planning how to adapt. Another human, a young man named Paul whose spine had been partially severed by debris, emerged from the operating room. The prognosis was not death. It was rehabilitation, physical therapy, potential recovery of mobility. A severed spine. And they were talking about recovery. But the moment that broke something in Draven came later. A little girl was brought through the bay. She was maybe 8 years old, with dark curly hair and wide brown eyes. Her ribs were broken, bandages wrapped around her small torso. She was Amara's daughter. The girl walked up to the window of her mother's recovery room and pressed her small hands against the glass. Amara was inside, unconscious, covered in bandages and connected to machines. The burns made her almost unrecognizable. The girl did not cry. She did not scream. She just stood there, watching her mother breathe. A nurse tried to lead her away. "Sweetie, you should rest. Your ribs need time to heal." "I want to stay," the girl said. Her voice was steady, too steady for a child looking at a dying parent. "Mama will want to see me when she wakes up." "When? Not if." When. Draven's hands began to shake. He had seen warriors face death with courage. He had seen soldiers sacrifice themselves for their comrades. But he had never seen anything like this. A child with broken bones, refusing to leave her mother's side. A mother with fatal injuries, still fighting to survive because her daughter needed her. A species that looked at death and simply said no. The surgery for Amara lasted 11 hours. When it was over, David emerged looking exhausted but not defeated. "She will live," he announced to the waiting staff. "It will be a long recovery. Skin grafts, organ repair, extensive rehabilitation. But she will live." Draven finally found his voice. "How? How is that possible?" David looked at him with tired eyes. "Because she refused to die, and we refused to let her." He walked away to check on other patients. Draven stood alone in the corridor, watching the human medical staff continue their impossible work. His whole body felt numb. His mind felt broken in some fundamental way. 47 years of war. Countless battles. Innumerable wounds and deaths and horrors. None of it had prepared him for this. 3 months changed everything. Draven walked the corridors of Station Aurelia, 7, with different eyes now. The clean walls and sanitized air no longer felt like a punishment posting. They felt like the headquarters of something remarkable. The human survivors from the attack had mostly recovered. Not partially recovered. Not surviving with permanent disabilities. Recovered, Amara was walking again. Her skin was scarred, marked forever by the burns that should have killed her. But she walked. She talked. She laughed with her daughter in the recovery ward. The medical staff expected her to return to work within another 2 months. Robert had received his prosthetic arm. He was already learning to use it, practicing basic motor functions with the same casual determination Draven had come to recognize in all humans. He made jokes about being part machine now. Paul, the man with the severed spine, had regained feeling in his legs. Physical therapy was progressing faster than projected. The doctors believed he would walk again within a year. Not perfectly, perhaps, but walk. The little girl with broken ribs had healed completely. Draven often saw her running through the corridors, chasing other children, laughing like she had never been hurt at all. And that was the thing Draven still struggled to understand. The laughing, the joking, the smiling. These humans had survived horrors. Their bodies had been broken and burned and torn apart. Any other species would carry that trauma forever, would become hollow and haunted by what they had endured. The humans told stories about their injuries. They compared scars. They made dark jokes about death and then laughed together. Draven had finally asked David about it one evening. They were sharing a meal in the common area, something that had become routine over the past months. "How do you do it?" Draven asked. "How do you survive so much and still find reasons to smile?" David considered the question while chewing. "I think it is because we have to. If we let every injury and every loss break us mentally, we would have given up as a species long ago. So we learn to process trauma differently, to find humor in darkness, to keep moving forward because standing still means dying." "That sounds exhausting." "It is," David admitted, "but it is also liberating. When you accept that life will hurt you, that your body will break, that death is always nearby, you stop being afraid of it. You start appreciating what you have while you have it." Draven thought about his own life. 47 years of war had made him hard, cold, detached. He had stopped appreciating anything long ago because appreciation led to attachment, and attachment led to pain when things were lost. The humans did not work that way. They attached themselves to everything, to each other, to their work, to their patients, to life itself. They knew they would lose things. They knew they would be hurt. They did it anyway. That night, Draven submitted his formal report to Velmari High Command. He had been asked to assess humans as a species, to determine their potential value to the Coalition, to decide if they were worth protecting or if they should be classified as a minor species requiring constant support. His report rejected both options. Humans should not be protected like fragile children, he wrote. They should not be classified as weak or minor. They were forged by conditions that would exterminate any other known species. Their bodies were not soft. They were weapons of survival. Their minds were not naive. They were adapted to handle trauma that would destroy other beings. His recommendation was simple. Treat humans as equals. Treat them as allies. And if war ever came to the Coalition, put humans on the front lines. Not because they were expendable, because they were survivors. Because they would take damage that would kill others and keep fighting. Because they would refuse to die. A week after submitting his report, Draven found himself sitting at another meal with the human staff. David was there, along with Priya and Robert and several others. They were sharing food and stories and laughter. Someone made a joke about their various injuries. Another person responded with an even darker joke. The table erupted in laughter while Draven watched with something approaching wonder. "You are quiet tonight," David observed. "Something on your mind?" Draven looked around the table, at humans who had been burned, broken, cut open, and put back together. At survivors of a death world who had looked at impossible odds and simply refused to accept defeat. "I am trying to understand something," Draven said slowly. "What?" "I spent 47 years in combat. I became hard. I became cold. I stopped feeling things because feelings were weakness." He paused, searching for the right words. "You have all suffered more than most soldiers I have known. And yet you are warm. You are kind. You still care about things." David nodded slowly. "I think that is the real secret of human survival, Commander. We did not survive by becoming cold. We survived by staying warm, by caring about each other, by finding reasons to keep going even when everything hurt." He smiled. "Our bodies heal. That is biology. But what really keeps us alive is each other. The connections, the love, the stupid jokes we tell to make each other laugh." Draven thought about this for a long moment. Then, slowly, he felt something crack open in his chest. Something that had been frozen for decades began to thaw. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "I have been surviving wrong." David reached across the table and clasped Draven's scarred hand. "It is never too late to learn." For the first time in 47 years, Commander Draven Kasuth smiled, and he meant it.